Hi, good afternoon and welcome to the Environmental Social Governance webinar on behalf of IOSH Logistics and Retail. We are delighted to have two excellent speakers today, James Alexander and Luke Withers from Lockton Company. They've got many years experience in environmental social governance, and to make best use of today, we're going to keep all the introductory chat to a minimum, and I'm going to hand over straight away to James and Luke. There will be an option for questions at the end. We also will be making sure that if we do have any questions that overrun, then we'll present those afterwards for the guys to answer, because I know there's an awful lot of you that have joined the webinar, so welcome again. If you've got questions and they don't get answered live, then rest assured we'll do all we can to get those answers to you at the end. Over to you, gentlemen.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'll just share my screen. We did a dry run, so I'm hoping it works. There we go. Is it up, James? We good?
Yeah, I can see that, Luke. Thank you.
Well, excellent. Right. So yes, well, afternoon, everyone. I thought I'd actually just start by giving a bit of context here as to why we've approached the subject and the way in which we've done so. So it'd be a bit of remiss of me as an insurance professional to not start with a bit of a disclaimer. We are by no means specialist ESG consultants or legal advisors. James can certainly profess to be more of an environmental expert than I, and I'll let him explain a bit of that in his introduction. But what we are is risk and insurance placement advisors. So my role within Lockton is to work with some of our large corporate and multinational clients, placing and managing insurances on a global basis. And with ESG becoming such a hot topic now in the mainstream media and increasingly so in boardrooms, we're now having really regular conversations with our clients and their senior leadership teams around the risks and impacts of ESG matters. So it's probably just worth briefly explaining my background as a way of understanding the approach that we have taken. So I actually studied my degree in safety, health and environmental management. One of my first roles after graduating was actually working for Amanda Chu, one of your vice chairs at Wilco's in her health and safety team. So when Amanda asked me to come and speak at one of your events, the answer was always going to be yes. But over the subsequent kind of decade, I then actually made the transition into insurance, into the insurance sector, firstly as a risk management consultant, and then kind of over the last 7 years in particular in a variety of corporate and multinational insurance broking roles. Now, I'm a big believer that foundation in safety and risk management and how transferable some of those skills are has really helped my career to date. And interestingly, so the best performing clients that I've worked with from a risk management perspective are those where the risk, insurance and health and safety teams have a really joined up approach. And we as the broker are able to work collaboratively across all of those functions. So I've made it a bit of a personal mission to help with kind of aligning these functions across industry and really to try to elevate how important these roles are within organisations. Probably been helped a little bit over the last 18 months somewhat with the pandemic, as it's certainly brought our professions into focus and validated how vital the work we do really is. But there's still some way to go. And really, I believe that ESG is another opportunity for risk, safety and environmental practitioners to further elevate what we do at a senior level within the businesses that you work in. And that's why the approach we've taken today really is to help explain why we think that, what's driving that change, and to provide some practical examples of how, the skills that you've already got and some of the challenges that you'll have faced in shaping the health and safety agenda will be very similar to those, the current ESG challenges for businesses are. So very quickly, before I shut up for a bit and let James introduce himself and talk to the first topic, the running order for today, essentially James will give a bit of an initial overview of some of the kind of regulatory changes that we've seen in recent years, but also some of the shifting social forces that are now kind of driving the agenda. I'll then follow on from that just to talk about how that's manifesting itself into kind of outcomes for businesses and how the bigger potential exposure now is from stakeholders as opposed to regulators. We'll then explain what that means in terms of outcomes for businesses and their directors. James will talk to what it means for accountability and sticking to promises. And then we'll finish up, as I say, with some examples of how we can help drive some of that change and utilise some of the skill sets that you all have. So I will hand over to James now to do a bit of an introduction and talk to the first topic.
Thank you, Luke, for the comprehensive introduction. And yeah, you're correct in describing me as the environmental one. My name is James Alexander. I've been working in environmental management since the very early 90s. I graduated in agricultural engineering from Cranfield University, and since then I've worked in underwriting, broking, and habitat protection and biodiversity restoration for about 11 years before I joined Lockton last year. One thing I think is worth mentioning is that ESG, or environmental social governance, is to me a new badge for good practice that we've all been applying to our business over the previous decades. ESG is a combination of the planet, the people that work within a business, and our neighbours, and policy. They're the 3 Ps that I put to ESG. And prior to ESG being a buzzword, it was corporate social responsibility, human capital, and policy. And my dogs are about to bark because the postman's at the door, but so I do apologise if that happens. But one thing I've noticed in environmental, the regulatory world is a standardisation across the continents, and that's being driven by the Financial Stability Board and the Task Force on Climate Change Disclosure, chaired by big hitters like Michael Bloomberg, and with the involvement of over 20% of the Fortune 500 corporates supporting the programme. The Task Force on Climate Change Disclosure is a mechanism for companies, when they're reporting their environmental performance wherever they are in the world, to have a standardised approach. And it's a big task, and it's been added to this week by the Task Force on Nature and Natural Capital Disclosures. But what's the relevance of the ESG change to businesses who are operating across continents and around the world? Well, the agenda is one of standardization, so that we can all compare and contrast how businesses are performing, not just in financial terms or dividends or profits, but in environmental impact as a result of their operations and within their supply chain, and also within their post-product chain, i.e. in the waste stream and the footprint of operation. And bringing it closer to home, post-Brexit, we've all forgotten the B word of Brexit with the challenges of the pandemic. But we have a thing called the UK Environment Bill, which is going through the legislative process at the moment. And what's relevant here is that the British government have a target to align all of their reporting on a country level to the Task Force on Climate Change declarations by 2025. Now, 2025 sounds a long way forward, but it's sort of 3.5 years away. It's not that far away. So we're all in a period of transition, and we're all in a period of preparation for standardized reporting. And one thing I'd like to refer to here is Financial Reporting Standard 12. It's not common on everyone's radar. It's not a topic we spend hours mulling over, but it's that bit of the balance sheet where corporates are declaring their contingent liabilities that they either know about and have identified, and also those intangible contingent liabilities that could occur in the future. And there is a lot of focus on what is contained within those contingent liability statements based on knowledge and based on best estimate of future trend. And that's where Luke's work and my work in Lockton Environmental is predicting how those future trends will affect people's bottom lines. Is that sufficient there, Luke?
That's fine. Yeah, great. So just kind of moving on from that topic, really, away from necessarily the regulatory side of things. As James has said, that regulatory environment has been there for a long period of time now. Environmental legislation, has been around for decades, and the threat of regulatory fines has also been there. I think we're all aware, not just on environmental issues, but also in the health and safety world, that the funding and resource required to really administer the regulatory environment is limited. Businesses have known that, and to an extent, some of the polluter pays principle fines have not been punitive enough to stop larger organisations from continuing with some of the practices that they've done. So, it's not necessarily the regulatory environment that causes issues. The real drivers that we're starting to see now for change are being driven by stakeholders. And that's why we've kind of said this move away from regulatory environment to stakeholder action. And those stakeholders can be consumers, they can be shareholders, investors, activist groups, and increasingly so, and James will touch on this later on, around exclusionary tests, but banks, insurers, other suppliers to your businesses, where if they see or are aware of certain practices, they may not be willing to supply into those industries, into those businesses. So, I've put a few relevant examples on the screen. We could have put loads on here, but we put a few that people will be aware of, and some that are a little bit more relevant at the moment. Everyone will be aware of the issues that Nike have had over the years with practices in the Far East and child labour, etc. We've had brands in the UK having similar issues, and when these issues get into the press, they can become viral instantly, and have an enormous impact on share price, brand value. And we'll touch a lot on that afterwards, actually, in terms of what that means for businesses and really what those risks and exposures are. But I've also put an example up here about Pandora. Me and James saw this the other week, and it's quite incredible, really, when you think about one of the largest jewelry makers in the world has basically made a firm commitment to move away from mined diamonds. All of their diamonds now will be synthetic production. Considerable shift in their USP, in their business model, in order to stay relevant and to manage those kind of social exposures. A bit closer to home for us in the insurance industry, we've put up here about Extinction Rebellion, dumping a load of fake coal outside of Lloyd's of London, which is the Lloyd's market, principal UK market in London. And this is another good example of an industry that isn't conventionally thought of as a major environmental damage facilitator, but we're now getting actors saying, well, we want you to stop insuring certain coal mines, certain activities, and that is driving change within our industry. We're starting to see insurers, as we said before, applying exclusionary tests where they won't insure certain activities, certain businesses, if they feel that there's a particular negative environmental impact in their activities, and that trend is only going to grow. We've touched a lot here on kind of the environmental side of things, but and I think that is the case at the moment. A lot of the ESG debate centres around climate change and environment, but that social aspect to it, is also incredibly significant. Even more so for certain sectors where you're a consumer-facing brand. So retail being a prime example. Brand value is now closely aligned to social status and consumer sentiment. The enormous growth that we've seen, an adoption of social media, and the increased influence that it now has on the general public and consumers. Situations that in the past that might have seemed fairly trivial or potentially easy to brush under the carpet or get on top of, can become viral in a matter of hours. And as I said before, seriously damaging consumer confidence, brand value, and ultimately a business's share price. A concept actually that many of you on the call will probably be familiar with, and it's something we're starting to talk to clients about a lot more, is a concept called risk velocity. And essentially it's the time that passes between an event occurring and the impact being felt by the business. So it essentially adds another dimension to the normal kind of two-axis risk assessment of likelihood and harm. And what it does is it can kind of highlight some of those low impact or low probability events that maybe don't feature in your kind of top 10 risks on your risk register. But actually, some of those lower value risks could actually be extremely volatile, and fast moving. And to an extent, what we're starting to speak to clients about is they almost need to be treated separately, in their own right. That yes, they may not be hugely impactful and the probability might be relatively low, but actually if one of these events occurs and it opens a Pandora's box and you've got issues and risks flying at you at 100 miles an hour, you need to have a proper crisis plan for that. You need to have a strategy for it, and we'll touch on that later on actually, about how, again, as safety, health and environmental practitioners, some of the learned skills that you'll have from managing those issues from a health and safety perspective are very transferable, into managing those sort of situations as well. Another thing that we're seeing, it relates very, very closely to this, and again, we touch on it a little bit later, is reputational risk. We're starting to see it feature really near the top of business risk registers, again, in particular within the retail sector. The growth of social media, forces behind ESG agenda, it's not going away. It's building real traction now. And again, as can be seen by some of the decisions made over the weekend, I saw something in the paper, my wife was talking about it, that I think Victoria's Secret have decided to get rid of the existing cast of models and scrap the annual catwalk that they do, a real shift in their business model and actually with their USP, and move into, something that's more relevant and listening to consumers and moving their entire business model as a result of public pressure and social issues around body image. It's another good example of drastic decisions being made by businesses and having to pivot quite quickly. So in summary, similar to the shift that we've all seen with driving the health and safety agenda, over the last few decades, it isn't necessarily the regulatory environment that forces rapid change. It's the sentiment and actions of stakeholders, it's exclusionary tests, and ultimately the court of public opinion, has more power now than regulators do. We saw at, the Euros last week, Cristiano Ronaldo moving a couple of bottles of Coca-Cola, dropped their brand value by 4 billion. Incomprehensible really, but when you think about the power that some of these people have as influencers, the impact that it can have on a business, we're starting to see much more focus now on some of these issues because of the impact that it can have. So the next bit, James, is over to you to just talk about some of the specifics. Yeah. Not very relevant, but important.
Thank you, Luke. I just wanted to make reference back to the coal being deposited outside of Lloyd's on your previous slide. What many people don't realise is that environmental insurance is often a component of a permit to operate. So Lloyd's don't have a choice; they have to insure these polluting businesses in order to comply with the operational permits. So I just thought it was quite interesting that we're having coal delivered on our doorstep whilst we're effecting good insurance and risk management for producers of energy in the developing nations. But that's my personal opinion, of course. Moving on to slide, the shifting sands, and this was something that really struck a chord with me, having been involved in advising private equity and private equity owned business and PLC companies for the last 20 years, was the oil majors, the big five oil companies and the energy companies have often been operating outside of insurance markets. They're bigger than the insurance companies, and they have such influence and sway on energy policy and energy price and global business, whether it's transportation, manufacturing, and literally every fabric of the hydrocarbon industry. But two things have happened in the last 4 weeks, and the first one on the left-hand side of the slide there is the Netherlands, the Dutch court making a judgment against the Shell company to cut their emissions by 45% in the coming years, as a judgment at law rather than a guidance note after the event. So if Shell do not cut their emissions by 45% as they were planning to, they will suffer or incur further judgments at law. And that is a groundbreaking decision. And yes, it's in the energy sector, but it's the sector that's been largely untouchable for the last 75, 85 years. And now we're getting court judgments based on applying current law to past activities and future statements and obligations of a board of directors. And that's a material change. It's the first time that I've seen a target reduction in emissions actually made a legislative or legal judgment from a court. And so that's the legal side, that environmental risk and business performance for old companies with a big footprint is one issue. But on the other side of the slide here is the engine number one case against, not legal case, investment case with Exxon. And this to me was groundbreaking, because engine number one are a very, very minority shareholder in Exxon with around 0.3% of the shareholding. And they produced a document and canvassed the other shareholders, making the claim that Exxon were not serious about their environmental credentials and their sustainability aspirations, and they didn't have a suitable board of directors to deliver on the level of improvement needed to keep Exxon within the top five, and comparing them to other peers in the industry. This tiny activist investor in the space of this year now has 3 executives on the board of Exxon voted in by the other shareholders. Now, if ever there's an example of the power of calling out corporate behavior, which is fine. You know, Exxon's haven't broken the law to my knowledge. They haven't done anything other than they haven't accelerated their change quick enough in this transition that they're in. So I think for any members of boards who are out there who are considering, why is it relevant to us as a board? Well, there are activist investors and activist law firms who are actively looking for significant organizations to whom they can go against and publicize where areas of improvement are needed. And if that adds cost to the business and it's a third party claim against the business, that's a risk that we believe our clients and our prospects should be aware of. But in 23 years, these 2 cases coming in one quarter of 1 year, to me, isn't an accident. It is evidence of a very real change.
Agreed. And just on that point, our next slide's really focusing on those consequences and liabilities. And James and I are going to split some of this slide up just in terms of points that we are directly involved in with some of our clients. And leading nicely on from some of those points that James has just made, the first piece that I will talk to kind of combines some of these aspects around directors' duties, share price, investor litigation, a topic that will of course pain for your board of directors and anybody on the call who's involved in placing insurances for the businesses they work for, will have been directors and officers cover. In recent years, it's been a really challenging aspect of the insurance market. Some dramatic shifts in attitudes from insurers, some really large litigation settlements in the US, Australia, even here in the UK, which has really challenged the availability of insurance capacity and has ultimately pushed up pricing and made obtaining the same limits that people used to buy more of a challenge. For those of you that on the call that aren't familiar with D&O insurance, at a very, very high level, it's essentially insurance that's purchased by a business for its directors to provide an element of financial protection if they fail in their legal duties, and there's then subsequently litigation against the business and them as individuals. And we are starting to really hear now concerns from insurers around what they feel to be the potential litigation related to ESG matters. So James has kind of just touched on it there around, these tests of and commitments made by boards of directors and companies, and if they are not met, the impacts and the actions that can be taken by shareholders for not doing so. If you've invested in that business, you're a green activist investor, they've made a commitment and you've invested on that basis, if they fail to reach those targets, it impacts the business negatively. The share price drops. That's where we could start to see shareholder litigation, against companies. And unfortunately, that is driving even more concern into that market, which is already fairly strained. We've seen examples, in recent years, the power of social media again, the likes of Elon Musk putting a tweet out, the day after Tesla's share price can drop by 20%. We're talking significant swings when you look at the market capitalization of Tesla. And that causes concern, for directors and officers, insurers. So, businesses, anybody on the call today that's involved in insurance renewals, insurance placements, need to be prepared for more probing and much more scrutiny from insurers around controls and measures in place to mitigate ESG issues, and also questions around where are you in those, commitments that you've made to some of those ambitious targets. How feasible is it? Where are you on that journey? And for those businesses that can't provide a good narrative or response to some of those questions and evidence the controls that are in place, I think we'll find it trickier to obtain insurance at the levels they require, and certainly at a higher cost. I'll touch very briefly on brand value. We've mentioned it before already. Reputational risk, brand value, it's a real concern now for businesses. It will be on the forefront of the minds of your directors and the boards that you work for. The impacts and the issues that this can have on a business's market value and its ultimate reputation and its ability to be able to attract new customers is significant. We've mentioned about things going viral overnight, and at the same time now we've got investors that can mobilize and move at such a pace, extracting value out of the company. As we said before, activist investor groups that can mobilize as well. The effects can be almost immediate. So it's important to have strategies and plans in place, for that, which again we'll touch on later on. And the last one before I just hand over to James to cover off some of the things he's been experiencing, is a concept that again isn't particularly new. Social inflation, which you'll see on the screen, not a new term, but again is something that's being discussed more now. And the public mood and businesses' ESG performance, certainly plays a factor here. Essentially, what social inflation is, it's where we see settlements for injury or damage claims against large corporates, in particular in the US, escalating rapidly, and it's mainly due to public attitudes and the feeling that the general public have towards big corporations. In the UK, if you go to court on a civil matter, you'll be in front of a judge, or perhaps 3 judges if you go to the Court of Appeal. In the US, there is a jury who has a say in the awards of damages, and they will often side with the claimant as opposed to large corporations. We've seen some examples of significant settlements in the US in recent years for opioids and fertilizers, etc. There, where punitive damages and the settlements are eye-watering. So as I say, it is certainly more of an issue in the US, but we are seeing signs of it in the UK from regulators and ombudsman services where, it's not necessarily in a courtroom, but there's a particular ESG issue or where it's attracted major public profile and pressure. And these regulators and ombudsman services are starting to be more punitive with their fines and settlements as well. We've also seen real growth in the UK in recent years in litigation funding, which essentially removes some of the financial barriers for claimants in big mass action and class action lawsuits. And that will lead to a surge in litigation activity, and ultimately leads to higher settlements and, unfortunately, pressure on insurance premiums, which are already, being challenged. So I'll just pass over to you, James, to talk to some of your specifics on here.
Thanks, Luke. You raised so many important factors there for the boardroom and for the boardroom's advisors, whether in-house or out-house. But if I can just go back to the Task Force on Climate Change Disclosures and this sort of 5-year transition we're in to standardise our reporting obligations, or the reporting obligations. I think it's worth remembering that the reporting obligations have been there for many, many decades, but you've only had to report the amount of reserve that you have and the period you're holding it for, and how you're holding it, whether letter of credit, parent company guarantee, or escrow cash in the bank. The change in this period as we go into following and aligning the Task Force on Climate Change Disclosure methodology is that the expectation is that we're now going to report what the provisions relate to. Do they relate to third-party property damage? Do they relate to bodily injury claim against issues with employees? Do they relate to natural capital damage or biodiversity impact, or legacy waste management costs in another continent? So for risk managers, managing the contingent liability statement is one thing. Allied to the big data world we're in, and the fact that we can have baseline information gathered almost instantaneously, that's a very, very intoxicating mix of obligation to make a provision and then an obligation to define what that provision relates to. But what does it mean to investors? Now, we talked about exclusionary testing, and I'll just mention what that means in the real world. If a private equity company or a venture capital fund establish an investment objective, they will search at 50 target businesses in the European Union. And if any of those businesses have exclusionary activities, perhaps tobacco, or perhaps engagement with coal mining, or perhaps engagement with other sensitive activities, perhaps defense industry, or supply chain engagement with a potentially sensitive industry, they will instantly stop that investment decision there and then. So instead of investigating, is the business in transition? Are they coming out of that sector? Exclusionary testing is reducing the amount of capacity available in the open share investment market. Luke has mentioned negative actors and activists. I'm always aware as a broker that I've got to be advocating for my clients and understanding the risk horizon of where we're operating. But organizations such as Client Earth, a not-for-profit law firm set up by leading lawyers to use the law to improve sustainability in business and macro environmental improvement, they've been around now for 10 years, and they're forcing real change. But the final thing on this slide really is about carbon statements, and how this is the only time in my career history, and I think it'll probably be in the career history of everybody listening, where we're in a period of rapid transition. And the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the importance of the transition, and it has really made the S of ESG and the G of ESG most important, because it's about society and it's about policy and penalty and governance. And no new business is going to set up and say, we're going to start a business and we're going to use coal and oil exclusively and we're going to throw everything in the sea. Of course, they're not going to say that. But every new business, I think consumers expect excellent performance in all segments as the minimum standard. So that's where we're starting from. We need to do the absolute best for the E, the S, and the G. I think I've covered that slide now, Luke. I can't see if there's anything else to mention on that.
Some of it I think gets picked up on the next when we kind of move into accountability. Again, just wanted you to pick up some of this and what you've seen, recent examples.
Yeah. I've put this slide up really, and Luke spotted the MI6 green spying on the world's biggest polluters to see if climate commitments are being met. Now, that's no surprise to me, because I've been working in this world for so long. The European Space Agency, the Sentinel Hub, our security organizations, and individual data analysis companies around the world are now using big data to monitor the status of the macro environment, of our marine environment, and to highlight areas where people are breaking the rules and countries and companies are breaking the rules. And when I'm just reading from my notes, but just at the G7 last week, there was a call for the TFCD reporting obligations to be compulsory rather than a standard and accepted, regulatory standard, to be compulsory for all regions of the world. Now, I think that's a good thing, because we can compare. You can compare and see your improvement. You can prove to people we're doing better than we did last year. Everybody assumes that environmental data, such as being a green spy using Sentinel Hub and plotting pollution patterns, as I do for a hobby, because I'm such a geek. If I can do it here on Google and on my iPad, that means an activist can, a neighbor can, but it also means we can, as operating businesses, we can identify the best improvements to make for our footprint and for our business, and we can focus our capital allocation, our operational footprint to those regions. So big data is a good thing, but it all links into these reporting obligations, because everybody needs a baseline. We need a baseline to see how much we're improving the environment as a result of our activities. Those companies that are not keen on establishing a baseline, I would question and say, why are you not keen on understanding your footprint, your operational footprint? Surely you want to make it better, or is it perfect already? That's quite an inflammatory question, because everything we do has an impact on the natural world and natural capital. But we can really make a difference by deploying big data and big approaches in an intelligent manner with all other advisors to your businesses.
James. So this last slide, again, I think it's going to be a bit of a combined effort between myself and James. Essentially, this is the crux of my initial opening statement, which it's about the ways in which you, as risk safety environmental professionals, can help to facilitate some of this change. So we've spoken about a lot in those previous slides, and the last one in particular about how do you assess risk, how do you quantify it, how do you understand where it is within your supply chain, within your business, and as I've already said, a lot of this will not be new to a lot of you present today. Many of the challenges here are similar to those that the health and safety industry has had to tackle over the previous decades, in terms of raising the profile at a senior board level, getting fundamental buy-in, shifting attitudes, educating the leadership team, and principally risk identification, and quantification and management. These are things that will be familiar to all of you on the call. You'll see we've put again a few examples up here of some of those ideas, some of the things that you can consider, challenging the agenda, insulating and educating the board. And one way we've done that, as a good example in the past with clients is that more so around corporate manslaughter, but putting these kind of mock trials, on and conducting desktop scenarios. It's now just as important to have that crisis response plan, and to have comfort and confidence within the board, within the leadership team, with your suppliers, around how to react to some of these issues, which are going to become more regular. So having that major incident response plan, and arguably, again, the people on this call will have been through that process before, will have that experience, and again, it's very transferable. So those are the sort. It's a good example of one of the areas where I think that we could be stepping in to help our businesses and progress some of this at a strategic level. And again, as I touched on before, one of the basic foundations here is about risk identification and management. James has touched on it with TCFD and the requirements that are set out in that. One of the requirements in that is to identify and demonstrate what you think the risks to your balance sheet, to your physical assets are from the impacts of climate change over time. So, it's about identifying where your asset base is, understanding, if global warming goes up by 1, 2, or 3 degrees, what does that mean for that asset in terms of exposure to increased, patterns of natural catastrophes and flood storms and hurricanes, etc. What does that actually mean tangibly to that business? And from a strategic perspective, should we continue to be in that area? Should we look to invest elsewhere? Or actually, we can't move, because of our business model, but actually we need to invest in, better air conditioning if it's in an area where we know that temperatures are going to increase year on year. And those are the sort of things that we can help with as a business. It's the sort of thing we come in and do with clients, and we work with our partner firm 427 and help to map out and analyse what those risks might be, and give some of that advice around what some of those transition management tasks could be for you as a business. So another good example where it's a language that's common to yourselves: risk management, risk identification. It's stuff that you're familiar with. It's just applying those principles in a different context. I mentioned on here about emerging consequential risks of change. For me, probably a better way of terming it is it's the underlying risks of transition. A really good example is something that we're actually doing some work on at the moment at Lockton, and I'm just in the process of preparing a paper with our head of fleet and transport. But it's that shift towards electric vehicle fleets. Most businesses now that run a fleet of vehicles have made, again, quite big ambitious statements about shifting towards fully electric vehicle fleets. If it's cars and vans, etc. Appreciate we're some way down the line, some way off yet in terms of heavy goods vehicles, but the pace of change at the moment, that may draw in closer. I think I saw something about Brewdog the other week had got the first 32-ton electric chilled vehicle out. So these things are coming, and again, it's about understanding what are some of the consequential risks of that. So fantastic from an environmental perspective, fantastic financially for the business as well, with some of the tax incentives. But what does it actually mean practically for you as a business in terms of your risk base? Some of the things that we're starting to see are, in particular in car fleets, if you all of a sudden shift to Teslas, or even the entry-level model Teslas, they're classed as a category 50 vehicle on the ABI. It's one of the highest categories you can have as a vehicle. It does 0 to 60 in something like 4 seconds. Do you want younger people behind the wheels of those vehicles? People who are relatively inexperienced drivers. What are some of the consequential costs of damage to these? Tesla has to go to a Tesla-approved repairer. We don't have a large network of that in the UK or the infrastructure to support it at the moment. So what does that mean if it gets damaged in an incident and you've got a 3-month turnaround, higher costs of a vehicle on hire whilst it's being repaired? It's trying to understand what are some of those consequential impacts of that transition and that change. Businesses, directors will want to make some of these big statements and these big transitions, but as always, it's our responsibility as safety, health, risk managers to take a step back and say, actually, what are some of those underlying considerations here? And do we need to think about whether the availability of insurance is actually there for this transition? There's very few insurers now that will do a pure electric vehicle fleet. There's not enough data available at the moment to understand what those future cost trends will look like. So there's some nervousness within the insurance sector around full adoption of electric vehicles. So that's another good example. Say I've touched on reputational risk a few times today, but there are some quite innovative solutions available now in the market for assessing what that reputational risk is, actually putting a value to it, and actually insuring it. It's a relatively new market at the moment, so it's not cheap. There's not an abundance of capacity or competition out there at the moment, but that will come. As I said before, with reputational risk being so high on the agenda and at the top of corporate risk registers, the insurance market is moving with that. It's probably not moving as quickly as it could do, but the likes of Beazley, etc., are coming up with quite innovative ways of insuring reputational risk and transferring that financial impact off the balance sheet. So do you want to just mop up, James, with your...
Yes, I'm happy to, Luke. Thank you. I'm very conscious of the time, and so we've got some time to go through some of the questions. But skeletons in the closet, I put that to everybody. If there are legacy issues and past operations, past facilities, divested property where there is a known obligation, now is the best time to talk about it with your advisors. Look at the consequences, look at the models, because if you're in a position of knowledge and you fail to do anything about it, then the consequences are obvious. I always say to people as well, historic insurance coverage for historic issues and past issues is readily available. We do it all the time. biodiversity impact. Pollution doesn't necessarily need to be an oil spillage or a physical pollution condition. It can be impact on the natural world. It can be impact on biodiversity as a consequence of legitimate operations. So always get a microscope out, get a magnifying glass out, have a close look at where you're operating. And if there's any uncertainties on the geography or the region or the sensitivity, have a chat with your advisory panel. Hopefully it's Luke and Lockton, Birmingham, but it could be anybody. I had a claim in the UK on a port facility where the dredging activity at the port disturbed natural silt and sand. That caused a reduction in the amount of cockles and crustaceans that were available to harvest. And that was an £18 million claim for 1 year of diminution in value or loss of gross revenue on a cockle harvest. Now, no pollution as in no spillage, normal traffic, normal dredging, permitted dredging. So these risks are often very, very obtuse, quite indistinct, but when they come home, to look at a policy wording and find you don't have coverage can be difficult. But the supply chain is the key piece to evaluate. And the final thing I wanted to mention is challenge the agenda, challenge the board, or challenge the agenda both on, say, are we doing the best we can? And one example of this for me is PFAS, and everybody's thinking of PFAS as firefighting foam. It's a forever chemical, but when I started in the industry, PFAS intervention levels were about 20 parts per million. So if we think of that number, 20 parts per million. Now, this month, it's being intervened at levels of 8 parts per trillion. So we've gone from 20 parts per million to 8 parts per trillion. There's no change in operation, but the regulators have the power. If they think there's chemicals there that are polluting and damaging, they could be legacy, they will come and look for them. So to be prepared to get the skeletons out of the closet is the best way, because if you're prepared, you can say, it's okay, we've got this, and you can keep control of your risk agenda. Thank you very much for listening to me. I think that's where we're at on this 5-year journey. It is a journey, and I think where we'll be in 5 years' time will be very different to where we started at the beginning of 2020.
Agreed. So I think, again, conscious of time, I think we'll cut it off there, and we'll open up for some questions.
All right, thank you guys. That was quite interesting discussion, and we've had a lot of interesting questions coming in as well. So the first question we have is from Caleb Blue. He's asking, he's saying that it seems that the focus of ESG currently is on environment and government in terms of disclosures. Mm-hmm. Do you foresee any focus on social, and how do you measure these social impacts moving forward?
Yeah, I think from what I'm seeing, that social element is picking up pace, and I think it's picking up pace as a result of, as I said before, the emergence of social media, the consumer power now, the power that individual influencers can have. So I think the attention is shifting more to that, but I think environmental is always going to stand out above social on the basis of the impact it has. You know, the impact it can have on the planet, the impact it can have longer term. It is the bigger risk, you know, globally, and I think that's probably why it is getting more attention. You know, its proximity to it causing impact to us is getting closer all the time, and you know, you've got real multinational global attention being placed on it. So whilst I think social will grow in the ESG debate, and we're starting to see it more, in particular in the UK and the US, you know, where we've got kind of liberal democracies and there's more attention by the public on some of those issues, I think it is growing. But I think, as I say, for me, environmental will continue to be the standout part of the agenda, purely because of the consequences of it and how quickly it's moving on us.
Okay.
Yeah, can I add to that, Luke, quickly?
No.
Yeah, I think that with the social element, we must think of the other S there, sustainability. And I believe the more companies are transparent about their operational footprints and the more data they choose to collect and use from their stakeholders, their employees, their customers, and their communities in which they operate, then with transparency and with disclosures, this will snowball and the S will come to the forefront. The Control of Pollution Act was introduced in the 1960s in the UK. So we've had pollution legislation and maritime pollution legislation for nearly over 100, getting on for 100 years in maritime world and 80 years on land in the United and European Union. So it's a very good observation that environmental is at the forefront. But I think environmental is well regulated already, but the sustainability and social aspect will become to the fore within 2 to 3 years post-pandemic.
So stemming from that question, Paul Vimark asks, how do you measure the social aspects? His experience in developing national mining and minerals, he's seen that the development has been good. Are there any economic and social infrastructure as positive? So how do you measure the social aspects then?
It's common. It's almost unique that you can choose the indicators that you want to reference and baseline. Within the mining space, it's often you'd have an environmental impact assessment that will include Indigenous and First Nation people's claim on the land upon which the mining is going to be undertaken. You'd probably reference social indicators such as gross income per capita, education levels, access to health and water, sanitation, education, and you'd have societal values upon which you can compare and contrast the region of operation compared to other mines in other regions. But in terms of establishing your social footprint or the impact and baseline position, a company can choose that they can follow the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Initiative goals. There's a framework there of 17 things that are classed as essential for sustainable development. But you can add to those with site-specific or regional specific things that are important to that catchment, that mine, that activity, or that product. So yeah, it's about choosing what you want to analyze, analyzing it, and having it independently peer-reviewed. But there are many ESG consultancies who can assist you with that.
Okay, so you spoke earlier on standardization. Do you see the use of ISO standards for sustainable procurement and social responsibility, and those companies that embrace and follow them as being treated favorably by investors and insurers?
Yeah, 100%.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Whether it's ISO or some other sort of international standard, that is the direction of travel now. We've seen already, and James has touched on it, when we're getting it, and we have seen it firsthand with some of our clients, if we're getting into mergers and acquisitions, if something is unearthed where they think there's a legacy issue or there's potential for it to not meet, for it to deter from the targets that the acquiring business has set, that will now be a fundamental decision in somebody exiting a deal.
SSAB did that.
Yeah, we put an example up on the slide. I'll let James talk to it. Actually, he's a little bit closer to it than me. But
this was a sale of a steel business, and SSAB did their pre-acquisition due diligence and discovered that there were aspects of provisioning and aspects of previous environmental performance and human capital performance that meant they just walked away from the deal and they wouldn't consider the asset. So it's happening already now. That's one deal that's stalled because of negatives. But on the other hand, there are other funds who are actively establishing funds to buy businesses to turn around and turn from a poor performing business into a superb performing business with turnaround tech, rebrand tech, revaluation and remodeling. So it's almost the reverse of asset stripping. There is trillions of dollars flooding into ESG investment in retail, in logistics, in chemicals, in manufacturing, in all lines of business that supply the people in the room here. But for many people, it's about, they're doing it really well already. They've been doing it really well for years, but it's just about how it's being reported and how it's being standardized. And Ernst & Young have got some brilliant material, but the TFCD website itself, the TFND website, and the Financial Stability Board, have a look at those resources on there. They're freely available to everybody, and I use them routinely.
So ESG reporting is continuously changing and can be quite tedious. How effectively can management of change be made more efficient and attractive for investors to accelerate sustainable investments?
That's a great question, and I agree. At least you don't have to do it every day like I do. It's very tedious, but we've talked about a 5-year transition. So the reporting of these issues in FRS 12 and TFCD, it is going to change, and it's going to change every month and every quarter for the next 3.5, 4 years. But one thing is certain, that change is only going one way. It's going to improve understanding of what businesses' footprint looks like and how good they are compared to the next business. So you've got to report anyway. Make that reporting work for you. Speak to your brokers and advisors like Luke, and make that data and knowledge you're collating, get that to your underwriters to give you better coverage and more insulation and better bottom line performance. So you've got to do it anyway, so might as well do a good job, as my dad used to say.
Okay, so we've got a quite interesting question here from our President-elect, Ms. Hosking. She's asking, what is being undertaken to support those further down the supply chains and SMEs? The pandemic is creating a gap between those who can transform and those hanging on by their fingernails. Global corporates at one end, and on the other end, those who are an important part of what they do, but often small businesses, perhaps in locations where there are few controls.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to consider is that as it stands at the moment, things like TCFD are very much focused at the larger end of the market. So a lot of the kind of disclosure regulation and requirements that's coming through is aimed at that large corporates, purely because they have the ability to be able to make change more so than those kind of smaller businesses and smaller businesses in the supply chain. What I think we will see, which I think is going to potentially apply more pressure to smaller businesses, is that I think the requirements that are going to be set by large corporates will filter down through that supply chain. So if you wanted to supply into one of these larger tier 1 corporations, you're going to have to start to meet some of these standards. We're seeing exactly the same thing at the moment, going off piece a little bit, but in cyber risk, we're starting to see some big corporates requiring quite stringent cyber controls and cyber risk measures of their suppliers because of the rise of ransomware, etc., and some of the incidents we've seen there. So I think we'll see the same kind of applications put into environmental standards, and we're already aware of that anyway. We come up against it when we're looking to bid for a piece of business. Often now we're getting questions in our tenders and bids around what we're doing for in environmental social governance, etc. So we're seeing it as an industry as purely a service provider. So I think when you step outside of that into heavier industry, it is going to become more apparent. James, do you want to talk to anything that you're seeing in terms of what's available?
Yeah, I think the question raises a very, very important point about the difference between developed economy companies and developing economy companies, between scale and size and impact. Now, I often think of the elasticity of response for a company to a change in externality. When I was very lucky, I had a contracting business that I started with my wife, and we were a team of 2, and we ended up being a team of 30. But we started that business on a net zero principle. We were always operating on a net zero principle from day one all the way through. But being that size, we were able to change and adjust from diesel to electric within 4 weeks. Now, a large entity, a large corporation on long-term supply agreements doesn't have that elasticity of adjustment. But the difference here is that the large companies have the ability to influence the smaller companies in their supply chain and set the agenda and the standard. And sustainability as a key, a circular economy key, is one where everybody wins. and there isn't a profit maker and a loss maker. Everybody makes perhaps a little bit less profit, but they make it for longer. Now, it's a great question. It's one that we can take and discuss offline after the time, I guess, but I'd be happy to do that, of course.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. I'm going to pass you on to our chair, Andrew. Take it away.
Thank you, Ria.
Thanks, Ria. Thanks, both gentlemen. That was excellent. What a great session that was. For those that missed it, the recording is going to be emailed out to you directly so that you've got a copy of it. Thanks to everybody that joined. And finally, before we leave, thanks to Ria for organising those questions. That was excellent. We will try and respond to as many as we possibly can. So once again, James and Luke, thank you very much. A great session, and goodbye to everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
You're welcome. Thanks, Luke. Thank you, Ria and Ben, and everybody behind the scenes. Cheers.
Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.